Hi there. Tonight, you're not in your warm bed or beneath a soft blanket. You're standing in the middle of a frozen field, somewhere deep in medieval Europe, maybe England, maybe France, the kind of place where names of villages were whispered more than written. The air is a living thing, heavy and bitter, pressing against your face like cold iron. You can hear nothing but the crunch of your boots against frost-bitten mud, and the distant bleat of a goat huddled somewhere in the dark. The moon hangs pale and watchful, its light stretching over the land like silver cloth. Everything else, the wind, the night, even time itself feels older here. Older, and much less forgiving. Ahead of you, a faint glow flickers through a line of crooked wooden huts. They look as though the earth itself tried to swallow them long ago but failed. The walls lean inward, their beams scarred and blackened by years of smoke. The thatch above is caked in frost, glittering under the moonlight like a crown of ice. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the wood creak and sigh with the cold, the sound of a home struggling to stay alive. You pull your cloak tighter around your shoulders. The fabric is damp, and every step sends a jolt of chill through your bones. You think about fire, about warmth, about how far away both seem. This isn't the Middle Ages of shining armor or grand castles. There are no trumpets here, no silk banners dancing in the breeze. What stands before you is the forgotten reality, the quiet world of those who worked, endured, and slept through winters that could break even the strongest spirit. You push open the rough-hewn door of one hut, and the hinges groan as if scolding you for waking them. A burst of warmth greets your face. Not gentle warmth, but thick, smoky heat that smells of peat, sweat, and boiled turnips. You step inside and the door closes with a thud behind you, sealing you in the kind of darkness that seems to hum with breath and life. The hut is one room, just one. The walls are made of timber coated in a layer of mud and straw, known as wattle and daub. Cracks split the surface like veins, and through them, thin spears of cold air slide in. The ceiling is low enough that you instinctively duck. A small hearth sits at the center, a handful of embers glowing weakly like the dying heart of a creature too tired to fight. Around it, a family moves in a rhythm older than memory, slow, quiet, conserving every motion. A mother stirs a pot hung over the coals. The father, his hands thick with calluses, whittles a bit of wood into something small and shapeless. Two children sleep near the corner, wrapped in patched wool, their faces red from the uneven heat. And in the shadows, a pig lies curled on the straw floor, its body rising and falling with deep, steady breaths. There's no bed in the way you know it. No mattress, no frame, no sheets crisp and white. The bed is a mound of straw stuffed into a wooden box, softened only by the constant weight of the bodies that sleep upon it. The straw smells faintly of the stable, of animal and earth, but to them it's the smell of safety. You crouch near it, and your knees ache from the cold floor. You run your hand through the straw, it's coarse, prickly, and faintly damp. In the corner of your mind, you imagine trying to fall asleep here, your breath turning to mist above your face, the smoke from the fire drifting low and stinging your eyes. The family breathes through it not peacefully, but persistently. Each breath feels earned. The mother coughs softly, a dry, scratchy sound. The air is thick, full of wood smoke that hasn't found its way out yet because there's no chimney. The smoke lingers, curling around the rafters and escaping through small holes in the thatch. It blackens everything, the beams, the walls, even the inside of their lungs. But it also keeps insects away, dries the damp wood, and adds a strange kind of protection to the hut. The peasants know this. They've learned to live with the discomfort, because the alternative is far worse. A house full of frost, a night full of rats, or the slow rot of wet timber. You watch as the father tosses a handful of sticks onto the fire. They hiss and pop, releasing a smell sharp and earthy. Wood is precious here, not something you take for granted. Most of it is gathered from fallen branches or stolen from the edge of the Lord's forest. A crime punishable by lashes or worse. Every ember matters, and so the fire is never allowed to die completely. Someone always wakes in the night to poke at it, feed it, whisper to it like an old friend. Because in this world, a sleeping fire is as dangerous as a sleeping man either could fail to wake again. Outside, the wind howls through the trees. The door rattles, the pig grunts. The family doesn't flinch, they've heard worse. Winter, for them, isn't an event, It's a sentence, a long, bone-deep test of patience and endurance. Their survival depends not on comfort, but on routine. Every day they gather water from the frozen stream, patch cracks in the walls, and pray that the food they stored will last. They sleep not to rest, but to forget hunger for a few hours. And as you sit there, feeling the warmth on one side of your face and the cold creeping up your back, you begin to understand what survival truly means here. It isn't dramatic. It isn't noble. It's quiet, smoky, repetitive. It's waking up in the middle of the night to feed a fire and hoping morning comes before the frost bites too deep. It's wrapping your child in rags, knowing you'll shiver more so they can sleep a little easier. It's looking at the weak light of dawn and whispering gratitude for another day, even if it looks exactly like the last. The night grows heavier outside, pressing against the hut like a living thing. The sound of the wind is no longer just a hum, it's a voice, long and low, whispering through the gaps in the wood. Sometimes it sounds like laughter, sometimes like weeping. The peasants hear it every night through the deep months of winter, and they've stopped fearing it. The wind is part of their world, as familiar as hunger, as expected as prayer. The father glances once toward the door, as though checking the latch, then settles back onto his low stool. He wraps his cloak tighter, pulling it around his shoulders like armor. The fabric is rough and patched in more than a dozen places, but it carries the faint smell of wool and smoke, the scent of endurance. The mother lifts the lid from the pot hanging above the fire. A thin steam rises, curling toward the low rafters, heavy with the scent of barley and roots. She stirs it slowly, not because it needs stirring, but because motion keeps the blood moving in her fingers. The spoon clinks softly against the iron rim. Her eyes are tired, not from age, but from years of squinting through smoke and dim light. In a corner, a small clay lamp burns with a single wick. Its light is weak, a trembling halo that barely reaches the walls. Shadows move across the ceiling, like restless spirits pacing above them. The children murmur in their sleep, small sighs breaking the quiet. The youngest has his hands curled under his chin, the same way his father sleeps. The mother smiles faintly. Even in this cold, even in this hardship, there's a strange, simple beauty, a rhythm that binds them together. You sit there, watching, and realize how different the meaning of home is in this world. Here, home isn't a structure of luxury or comfort. It's a space that stands between life and the merciless cold outside. It's walls that don't fall, a roof that doesn't collapse under snow, a fire that doesn't die before dawn. Everything else, comfort, privacy, even cleanliness, comes second. The floor beneath you is a mix of dirt and straw. It crunches faintly when anyone moves. Every step releases a faint smell of soil and smoke, of years packed down by bare feet. The air hums with quiet sounds. The crackle of fire, the pigs breathing, the faint whistle of the wind sneaking through the thatch. And beneath it all, you can almost hear the pulse of human life, slow, steady, uncomplaining. In this small space, every breath counts. The fire burns unevenly, its light flickering over faces lined by fatigue and smoke. There's a faint shimmer of frost on the inside of the window slits, proof that the cold has reached in even here. A few dry herbs hang from the rafters, their silhouettes sharp against the dim orange glow. Sage, thyme, lavender, not just for flavor, but for luck, protection, and belief. In a time when doctors were rare and medicine was superstition, these herbs were charms of hope. You can almost imagine the mother whispering a small prayer as she ties them up, hoping the scent might keep illness away. The father finally rises, stretching his limbs with a faint groan. His joints crack like breaking twigs. He walks to the wall where a crude wooden chest sits. Its hinges are rusted, the wood swollen from years of damp, but it holds their most precious things: a few tools, a folded cloak, a small carving of the Virgin Mary. He touches the carving briefly, tracing its shape with calloused fingers. Faith is quiet here, not the loud, church-bound faith of the cities, but a soft, steady trust that the world won't end tonight. He murmurs something under his breath, a prayer perhaps, or maybe just a wish. The words melt into the sound of the fire. The mother serves the meal. Wooden bowls are passed around, rough and uneven, their edges darkened from years of use. The food is thin but hot, and in this cold, that's enough. They eat slowly, carefully, saving every mouthful. A few crumbs fall to the floor, and the pig snuffles them up without complaint. When the bowls are empty, the mother wipes them with a rag and sets them aside. She glances toward the fire, then adds another stick, small, crooked, but precious. Sparks leap and scatter, and for a moment the hut glows brighter. The children's faces, flushed with warmth, look almost peaceful. When the time comes to sleep, there's no ceremony. The father checks the fire once more, tucking a few embers together like a parent adjusting a child's blanket. Then, one by one, they settle down. The children first, then the mother, then the father last. They share the same straw bed, a small fortress of warmth in the freezing dark. The pig shifts closer, its body heat joining theirs. The air thickens with the smell of smoke, wool, and life. The fire dims, and the shadows grow softer. Soon, the only light is from the dying coals, faint red glows pulsing like slow heartbeats. And yet, the night is long. Sleep in a medieval hut isn't deep or uninterrupted. It comes in phases, broken by the cold, by coughing, by the need to tend the fire. Many peasants practiced what historians call first sleep and second sleep, waking for an hour or two in the middle of the night, talking quietly, praying, or even sharing stories before drifting back into slumber. It wasn't rest as you know it. It was endurance, disguised as routine. The mother stirs once in her sleep, pulling her child closer. The father shifts, his hand resting on the hilt of a knife near the fire. Even in exhaustion, instinct keeps them guarded. Outside, the wind moans again, brushing against the walls. The sound doesn't wake them. It's the lullaby they've known all their lives. You glance once more around the room before closing your eyes. The walls, the fire, the sleeping family, everything feels fragile yet eternal. The smell of smoke fills your lungs. It's harsh but strangely comforting. It tells you that, for tonight at least, the fire still burns. Sometime in the deep of night, when the last ember flickers and the frost outside turns the world into glass, the quiet inside the hut becomes absolute. It's a silence so thick it hums in your ears, filled only by the rhythmic breathing of those who sleep. Every exhale fogs the air above the straw. Every inhale draws in the smoky warmth that clings like a living blanket. The walls groan under the weight of snow, but they hold. Above, the thatch crackles faintly, maybe ice shifting, maybe a bird long since frozen in its nest. For the family inside, it doesn't matter. They've learned to read these sounds not as threats, but as part of the night's language. Outside, the world is merciless. The river that once sparkled in summer now lies hidden beneath a lid of ice thick enough to bear a man's weight. The fields are nothing but white plains scattered with the black bones of dead crops. Even the church bell, miles away, sounds muffled, swallowed by the cold air. In these months, villages shrink inward. Roads vanish. Life folds itself into small pockets of heat. A handful of huts like this one, breathing in the dark. The peasants know better than to fight the cold. They simply outlast it. Survival here isn't about strength. It's about rhythm. You wake, you work, you eat, you sleep. You keep the fire alive. You wait for spring. A cough breaks the stillness. The father sits up, the blanket slipping from his shoulders. His breath ghosts into the dark. He rubs his hands together, then reaches for the poker to stir the embers. They glow faintly, sighing at his touch. He adds a small log, the last of the bundle stacked near the hearth. The wood catches slowly, sending up a thin line of smoke. The light crawls back into the room, painting the walls in a trembling orange. He glances toward his sleeping children, then toward the door. He knows that beyond it lies a cold so deep it can kill in minutes. He's seen it take men before neighbors who fell asleep drunk in the snow, travelers who misjudged the storm. So he feeds the fire again, not just for warmth but as an act of defiance. You watch him and realize, for these people, survival isn't dramatic, it's sacred. Every motion, every decision is a small prayer. The act of keeping warm becomes a kind of faith. There's humility in it, not submission, but respect for nature's power. The peasants don't curse the winter. They accept it, absorb it, live alongside it. They know that comfort is borrowed, never promised. The warmth from the fire will fade, the straw will grow damp, the food will run thin. Yet every night they rebuild, reheat, repair. That's the real heroism, not grand battles or shining armor, but quiet persistence in the face of endless cold. In a corner, the mother stirs slightly, half awake. She reaches toward the sleeping child beside her, checking his warmth, then pulls the blanket higher. Her hand lingers a moment on his cheek, a gesture of pure instinct. Love, here, is practical. It's measured in firewood, in shared breath, in the way she gives her thicker cloak to the child without thinking twice. She knows tomorrow will be the same. Gathering sticks, mending torn cloth, keeping the smoke steady. The repetition would break most people, but for her, it's life. She finds meaning in survival itself, in the act of making it through one more night. The fire brightens a little more. Its light touches the wooden beams above, revealing tiny carvings, initials, marks, maybe prayers scratched years ago. Generations have lived in this hut. Each winter has left its mark, and yet the structure still stands. It leans, it creaks, but it endures. You wonder what stories the smoke-stained walls could tell of births and feasts, of hunger and laughter, of winters colder than this one. History, you realize, isn't just in castles or scrolls. It's in places like this, where lives were lived quietly but completely. As the first hint of dawn bleeds into the sky, a thin light seeps through the cracks, in the wall. It's blue and cold, but it means survival. The father exhales, almost smiling. Another night gone. He doesn't celebrate. He simply nods to himself and begins again. He nudges the pig awake, checks the pot near the hearth, adjusts a patch on the wall where frost has crept in. The mother sits up, her hair catching the weak light, and whispers something to the children still half asleep. The day begins as the night ended, without drama, without complaint, just movement, just life. You step outside for a moment, pushing open the door. The cold hits you like a wall, shocking and absolute. Your breath spills out in clouds that drift toward the pale horizon. The village is still. Smoke rises from a few other huts, thin grey lines against the white sky. Somewhere, a rooster crows hoarse, half frozen, but alive. The air smells of wood, earth, and distant frost. You turn back toward the hut, and through its cracks you see the glow of fire again, faint but steady. It's a heartbeat in a landscape of ice, and standing there, you understand the quiet truth of this world. Sleeping in a medieval hut wasn't rest, it was resistance. Every night was a test, every ember a small victory over the cold. The peasants didn't dream of comfort, they dreamed of endurance, of seeing another sunrise. Their wooden walls, their smoky roofs, their scratchy straw beds, all of it was proof that life could persist even when the world itself seemed frozen against them. So when you finally return to your own warm bed, when the modern hum of your heater fills the silence, think of them, those who slept on straw beneath leaking roofs, their breath mingling with smoke, their hearts beating in rhythm with the fire. They were the reason the kingdom endured. They were the warmth that history forgot. Morning in a medieval village doesn't begin with an alarm or a clock. It begins with smoke. Thin grey ribbons drift upward from the huts, bending with the wind, marking the slow return of life. The air outside is sharper now, almost metallic in the cold. Frost glitters on every surface, on the rough wooden doors, on the thatch roofs, on the hard soil that hasn't known warmth in months. The sun, when it finally rises, is weak and pale, more like a candle in a cavern than the giver of light. Yet for those who have survived another night, that faint light feels holy. The father steps out first. His breath hangs in the air, curling like smoke. He wears the same wool tunic he slept in, patched at the elbows and frayed at the cuffs. His boots are stiff with frost, and each step crunches loud against the frozen mud. He doesn't complain. No one does. Complaining doesn't make the cold leave any faster. He bends down, picks up the small hatchet leaning by the door, and heads toward the tree line. Today, like every day, begins with the same ritual: finding wood. Firewood is life. It cooks the food, dries the damp clothes, warms the newborn, and keeps death at a polite distance. Without it, nothing lasts long. But wood isn't easy to come by. The Lord's forests, thick, endless, rich with oak and ash, are forbidden. Cutting trees there is theft, and theft can mean punishment severe enough to scar a man for life. So the peasants search the borders, hedgerows, riverbanks, fields, gathering what the wind or time has already taken. Fallen branches, dead roots, bark that can be scraped away and burned. Sometimes they pull entire stumps from the ground, their fingers raw and bleeding. They know the forest guards are near, so they move quietly, listening for the jingle of chains or the snort of a horse. Each stick they carry home is a small victory, a defiance whispered into the cold. Meanwhile, inside the hut, the mother is already at work. Her morning starts before dawn, always. She kneels beside the hearth, coaxing the embers back to life. She blows gently, her breath merging with the faint orange glow until it blossoms again into flame. The smoke fills the room, curling toward the roof, and she coughs once, twice, before continuing. Then she reaches for the pot, the same one used the night before, and adds what remains of the pottage. Maybe a handful of barley, a sliver of onion, a bone saved from a feast weeks ago. The smell rises slowly, humble and real. The children stir on the straw bed, blinking at the dim light. The younger one yawns and pulls the blanket tighter. The older one sits up, rubbing his eyes with small fists. There's no talk of staying in bed. Morning is work, even for the small ones. You can almost see it, the rhythm of their morning. The scrape of wooden bowls, the clatter of spoons, the sound of water being poured from a clay jug. There's laughter, soft and tired, as the children argue over who gets the thicker piece of bread. Their mother hushes them with a smile. She doesn't have much to give, but what she gives fully. A small piece of warmth, a word of comfort, a reminder that survival, even in its plainest form, still carries tenderness. The father returns before midday, his arms burdened with wood. Frost clings to his beard like tiny beads of glass. His fingers are numb, but he doesn't stop to rest. He kneels by the door, breaking the wood into pieces, setting aside the driest for cooking, the thicker logs for the night. Every sound echoes the crack of the hatchet, the hiss of the fire, the occasional crow cawing from the woods. The day doesn't rush, it drags, stretching thin like the smoke that trails from the roof. Outside, the village stirs. You can hear distant voices, a woman calling her husband, a child laughing, a dog barking somewhere across the field. Beyond that, the faint rhythm of a hammer striking metal, the blacksmith. Already, awake, shaping horseshoes or mending plough blades. The air smells of smoke, manure, and the faint sweetness of straw. It's not pleasant, not by modern standards, but to those who live here, it's the smell of existence, proof that things still move, still breathe. By noon, the light shifts. The sun climbs higher, but brings no real warmth. The sky remains pale, drained of colour. The family sits near the doorway to eat a simple meal of bread, maybe cheese if they're lucky. They speak little. Words are energy, and energy is precious. Between bites, the father tells them of the forest, how the snow was thicker near the stream, how he saw a fox dart through the trees. The children listen with quiet wonder, imagining creatures that survive even deeper in the cold. The mother smiles faintly, her hands folded in her lap, eyes distant. She's thinking ahead about the water she'll need to fetch before nightfall, the torn cloak she must mend, the herbs she should check before they freeze completely. As you watch them, something strikes you how methodical it all is. There's no sense of panic, no rushing against the cold. Their survival depends not on bursts of effort but on steady repetition. It's a dance, practiced through generations. You rise, you work, you warm, you eat, you rest. You keep the fire breathing. Every action has meaning because it keeps them alive for one more day. By the time the weak sun begins to fade again, a familiar stillness creeps back into the air. The shadows stretch long across the frozen fields. The chickens shuffle toward their coop. The dogs curl into tight circles near the huts, and smoke thickens from every roof. The mother lights the hearth again. The children huddle closer, and outside, the wind starts its nightly song. It's a world balanced between silence and endurance, a fragile peace built on fire and faith. As the pale afternoon fades, the cold begins to thicken again, creeping through the cracks of the hut like an invisible mist. The villagers know this feeling too well, the slow, inevitable tightening of winter's grip. Every hour after sunset becomes a small test of endurance. Inside the hut, shadows lengthen, blending into the wooden walls until everything takes on a soft, smoky hue. The father sits by the door, sharpening the edge of his small knife. The sound, a slow, rhythmic scrape, fills the quiet room. Beside him, the mother patches a hole in a woolen cloak, her fingers moving deftly in the dim light. A single candle burns between them, its flame trembling every time the wind rattles the door. The children whisper to each other, their voices hushed, as if even speaking too loudly might draw the cold closer. Before night fully falls, the mother begins her small ritual, the one she performs every evening without fail. She checks the firewood stack first, counting each piece by touch rather than sight. Then she sprinkles a handful of dried herbs into the fire, rosemary, sage, and a pinch of thyme, not for magic, but for memory. The scent fills the air, sharp and earthy, reminding them of warmer months when fields were green and rivers ran free. For a brief moment, the hut feels alive again. Outside, the father steps into the twilight. The village is quiet now, wrapped in a deep blue stillness. Smoke rises from every chimney, turning the air thick with a ghostly haze. He walks around the hut, checking the straw walls, tightening the rope that holds the thatch in place, making sure no draft will sneak in tonight. He looks toward the forest, dark, endless, and listens. Only the wind answers. Satisfied, he returns inside and bolts the door with a heavy wooden bar. The world outside no longer exists until morning. Now begins the long night. The family gathers close to the fire, the only light in their small universe. The father sits cross-legged, carving a piece of wood into a rough figure, maybe a toy for his son, maybe just something to keep his hands busy. The mother hums softly, an old tune passed down from her grandmother. It's not a song with words, just a melody shaped by centuries of endurance. The children curl beside her, their heads resting on her lap, their eyes half closed. The warmth of the fire doesn't reach every corner of the hut. The farthest walls remain lined with frost, white and shimmering. The air smells faintly of smoke, sweat, and wool. But in the center, near the hearth, it's different. The heat there feels alive, like a silent guardian that breathes with them. Every flicker of flame casts a dance of shadows on their faces, and for a moment, it feels almost peaceful. When the fire dims, the family begins to prepare for sleep. There are no beds in the way we imagine them today, no feathers, no blankets, no comfort. Instead, there's straw spread thick on the ground, layered with old rags and animal skins. The mother shakes out the straw, fluffing it with her hands, brushing away the bits of dirt. The children giggle when the straw crackles beneath their fingers. Then, slowly, they all settle down together, one body after another, forming a single mass of warmth. The father lies on the outer edge, nearest to the cold, his back against the wall. The mother takes the middle, shielding the children with her body. The youngest curls against her chest, small hands clutching at her tunic. The older child sleeps near her shoulder, head resting against her arm. They cover themselves with whatever they have, old cloaks, patched sheets, even sacks used to store grain. Every layer counts. You can almost hear the sound of their breathing, steady and calm. The fire crackles softly, casting faint orange light across the floor. Outside, the wind moans through the trees, rattling the door but never quite breaking through. The walls creak, the roof groans, and now and then, a drop of melted frost slides down the wood and hits the ground with a faint tap. But inside, there's warmth, fragile, but real. This way of sleeping, huddled close, sharing body heat, wasn't just about comfort. It was survival. The human body, when joined with others, becomes its own kind of fire. They knew this instinctively, without science or explanation. It's how they kept their children alive through the hardest nights. And beyond the physical warmth, there was something else, a quiet sense of unity. In a world where everything was uncertain, this closeness was proof that they still had each other. Sometimes, in the stillness, the father would whisper a short prayer, not to be rich, not to escape, but simply to endure. He'd thank the fire for burning, the roof for holding, the earth for staying firm beneath them. The mother would murmur back, her words half asleep, half memory. The children wouldn't understand the meaning, but they'd feel it, the way the air seemed softer, the night gentler. Hours pass like this, slowly, almost tenderly. The fire fades to red coals, the air grows heavier, and sleep comes like a fog rolling in. Each person drifts off at their own pace. The mother first, then the children, and finally the father, who stays awake just long enough to make sure the last ember still glows. Outside, snow begins to fall, blanketing the village in silence. It muffles every sound, erasing the boundaries between hut, earth, and sky. Inside, 5 heartbeats move in rhythm. The world beyond may be cold and cruel, but within these wooden walls, a small miracle repeats itself every night. Life continues. Somewhere in the darkest hours before dawn, the fire shrinks to a faint, trembling glow. The hut is half asleep, half dreaming. Smoke curls lazily through the air, weaving soft ribbons that catch the faint moonlight slipping through the thatch. The air is cold again, not the biting, cruel cold of the open world, but a slow, creeping chill that seeps into bones and straw alike. The mother stirs. First. She always does. Her instincts are sharper than any clock. One eye opens, and for a moment she lies still, listening to the soft breathing beside her, to the distant groan of ice shifting on the frozen river, to the hush that only deep winter knows. Then, quietly, she sits up, moving gently so the children don't wake. Her breath fogs the air as she leans toward the hearth. The embers still glow faintly, buried under ash. She picks up a small stick, pokes at the coals, and blows softly. A single spark jumps to life. Then another. The sound is like a sigh. She adds a piece of kindling, then another, careful not to waste. The fire catches slowly, hesitantly, as if remembering what it's meant to do. Within minutes, the orange light returns, painting the wooden walls with warmth again. She cups her hands around it, whispering a small thanks not to God, perhaps, but to the simple magic of survival. The faint light wakes the youngest child. She rubs her eyes, murmuring something soft, then crawls closer to the warmth. The mother smiles and pulls her into her lap, wrapping the frayed blanket around both of them. For a few quiet moments, they just sit there, watching the flames dance. The fire isn't just heat, it's a companion, a rhythm, a heartbeat that tells them they've made it through another night. Outside, the sky begins to pale. It's not yet morning, but the first hints of grey stretch across the snow. The world is utterly still. No birds, no footsteps, no sound, but the whisper of the wind through frost-covered trees. It's a world paused between dreams and waking. The father wakes next. His breath comes in clouds as he sits up, stretching the stiffness from his shoulders. The first thing he does is check the roof beam, making sure no snow has weighed it down during the night. Then he kneels beside his wife, feeding another branch into the fire. Neither of them speaks much. Words are saved for later, when the day demands them. For now, silence is enough. The fire crackles softly, the child's head rests against her mother's arm, and in that hush, there's something sacred. This, more than anything, is what kept them alive. Not wealth, not power, but rhythm, the quiet rhythm of small, repeated acts of care. By the time the other children wake, light has begun to creep through the gaps in the wood. The frost on the inner walls glitters faintly, like crushed glass. Their breath still fogs the air. But now, there's warmth too. The mother stirs the pot from last night, adding a bit of water, scraping the thickened pottage from the bottom. It's not much, but it smells of smoke and salt and safety. The children eat in silence, still half asleep, holding wooden bowls between their hands like little fires of their own. The father opens the door a crack, and a blade of cold air cuts through the room. Outside, the world glows blue-white, untouched and cruelly beautiful. Snow lies deep on the ground, smooth and glittering. He steps out barefoot for a moment, his breath turning to mist. The cold bites, but he's used to it. He looks toward the horizon where smoke from other huts drifts upward in thin, steady lines. The village is waking, one fire at a time. Back inside, the pig snorts and shifts in the straw, shaking bits of hay into the air. The mother laughs quietly. Even in such a small space, life is everywhere in the sound of breathing, in the crack of the firewood, in the heartbeat of the floor itself. This hut may seem crude to us now, but to them, it's a universe. Every inch has purpose. Every smell tells a story. The smoky air, the damp straw, the heat against the skin, all of it is a language of survival, spoken without words. When the fire burns strong again, they prepare for the day. The father pulls on his heavy cloak, patched and stiff with age. The children wrap themselves in scraps of wool, their cheeks already pink from the cold. The mother ties her shawl tight and pours the last of the pottage into a clay bowl for later. Then, one by one, they step into the morning. The door closes behind them with a wooden sigh. Smoke curls lazily from the chimney hole, carrying the scent of ash and herbs into the icy sky. The day begins again, another test of endurance, another quiet victory. Inside, the hut stands empty for now. The fire crackles low, guarding the warmth they've left behind. The walls, blackened by years of smoke, seem almost alive, breathing, creaking, remembering. And if you stand there long enough, you can almost feel it. The echo of countless nights like this one. The lives that burned low and bright in places the world forgot. This was what sleep meant in the Middle Ages. It wasn't comfort. It wasn't rest. It was survival. Quiet, human, and sacred. In the world of medieval peasants, night was more than darkness. It was a living thing. When the sun fell behind the horizon, everything familiar vanished. Paths disappeared. Fields turned to endless plains of shadow. Even the sound of the wind felt different, carrying whispers that seemed almost human. For people who lived without lamps, without glass windows, without the hum of the modern world, the night was a realm of spirits, beasts, and imagination. Inside their wooden huts, peasants tried to build small islands of safety, the glowing hearth, the shared warmth, the prayers murmured before sleep. But outside that fragile circle of light, the unknown waited. Wolves prowled the edge of villages, their howls echoing through the trees. Bandits sometimes moved by night, stealing what little food peasants had stored. And beyond these real dangers lurked something deeper, the unseen world. You see, in the Middle Ages, faith was both comfort and terror. People believed the night belonged to forces that tested souls, restless spirits, witches, even the devil himself. The church warned that sin could invite such darkness, and so before sleep, families often whispered short blessings, crossing themselves or muttering Latin words they didn't fully understand. It wasn't about knowledge, it was about protection. To sleep was to surrender, and surrender meant trusting that something would guard you while you couldn't guard yourself. For the peasant, dreams were not just private illusions, they were messages, warnings. Sometimes they believed the dead spoke through them, ancestors appearing beside the fire or standing in the doorway of the hut, offering silent counsel. If a man dreamed of a frozen field, it might mean a poor harvest ahead. If he dreamed of fire, perhaps illness or anger was coming. Their world didn't divide the physical and spiritual like ours does. To them, both existed in the same breath, the same smoke rising from the same fire. In the corner of a hut, a child might wake crying, claiming to have seen something in the dark. The mother would hold them close, whispering an old phrase taught by her own mother, half prayer, half charm, and blow softly on the child's forehead, as if to push the nightmare away. There were no doctors to explain dreams, no books to interpret them, only the comfort of belief and the weight of tradition. The sounds of the night fed these fears and stories. The groan of wood as it expanded with heat, the rustle of mice in the straw, the cry of an owl, all could become omens. In a world where every sound mattered, imagination was both a gift and a curse. Some said witches rode the winds on cold nights. Others claimed that the souls of the unburied dead wandered near the fields, calling out for prayers. And yet, within this fear, there was something strangely peaceful. For every peasant who trembled at the creak of a door, another found beauty in it, a reminder that the world was still alive even when unseen. The stars above, sharp and infinite, looked down upon their huts like a silent congregation. The moon cast pale light across frozen rivers, making the earth shimmer as if dusted in silver. These people might not have understood astronomy, but they understood wonder. The night sky was their cathedral, vast and eternal. Sometimes, in the quiet hours between sleep and waking, a man might rise, open the door, and stand outside just to look. His breath would fog the air as he stared upward, searching for signs, maybe the North Star, maybe a glimpse of dawn. Behind him, the hut glowed faintly, the sound of his family's breathing steady and soft. In that moment, there was no fear, only awe. The kind of awe that comes from knowing how small you are in a vast, cold universe, and still feeling like you belong in it. But not all nights were kind. There were nights when the cold crept so deep that even the fire couldn't fight it off. When frost, formed on the inside of walls, and every exhale turned to a mist that hung in the air like ghosts. Those nights were the true tests, not of bravery, but of endurance, and every morning after one of those nights felt like a victory. As dawn approached, people would say they'd survived the night, as if it were a battle, because, in many ways, it was, against cold, against hunger, against fear, against the idea that the world beyond the walls might simply swallow them whole. Sleep wasn't rest, it was surrender, and every sunrise was proof that surrender didn't always mean defeat. Before sleep, every medieval peasant followed their own quiet ritual, small acts that meant everything in a world without control. Some would kneel beside the fire, crossing themselves 3 times while murmuring a single line of prayer. Others would simply trace the sign of the cross on the wooden wall, as though drawing a barrier between themselves and the dark. There was no fixed rule, only faith, habit, and hope. The mother might sprinkle a pinch of salt across the threshold, a simple act believed to keep evil spirits away. A bit of ash from the hearth might be rubbed on the doorframe, another protection handed down through generations. None of these things cost anything, but each carried the weight of centuries. To an outsider, it would look like superstition, but to them, it was survival dressed as belief. Then came the quiet moments before lying down, when the fire burned low, and everyone's shadows grew long and soft against the walls. The father might tell an old tale not from books, but from memory. Stories of saints who walked through snow barefoot and never froze, of travelers who lit a candle for the dead and found their way home. His voice would rise and fall like a slow chant, filling the hut with something warmer than heat: belonging. Outside, the wind pressed its cold hands against the wooden walls. Sometimes, it carried strange sounds, a cry that might be a fox, a whisper that might be nothing. But to the peasants, the night had meaning in every noise. A creak in the rafters could be a sign of bad weather coming. A sudden gust of wind might mean a soul passing by. The line between reality and belief was thin, and they walked it without question. Children learned early not to fear the dark, but to respect it. They were told that night had its own order, that unseen beings watched over the world while humans slept. Angels, perhaps, or the spirits of their ancestors. It was comforting in a way to think that even when you closed your eyes, something larger stayed awake for you. The fear of darkness was softened by faith in presence. And so, the family would finally settle into their bed of straw, wrapping themselves together like layers of fabric. The fire's glow would fade to red, and the hut would fill with the sound of quiet breathing. It's strange to imagine now, but in that time, the silence of night wasn't empty, it was full. Full of warmth, prayer, smoke, and the shared rhythm of life continuing in the dark. Sometimes, the father would dream of the field's endless rows of frozen earth, waiting for spring. The mother might dream of her children running barefoot through summer grass. In their sleep, even the poorest peasant could be rich, free, safe. The mind made its own warmth where the body could not. Dreams were their only luxury, unbought, unbroken, untaxed. And when nightmares came, and they always did, they had their own way of fighting them. The mother would whisper a blessing over the child, tracing a finger across the forehead, then spit lightly on the floor 3 times, not from disgust, but as a symbol of rejection, casting the bad dream away. Some families kept small tokens beside the fire: a sprig of hawthorn, a carved wooden cross, or even a bone from a long-dead animal believed to hold protective power. It's easy to dismiss such acts now, but when your world is ruled by hunger, cold, and unseen forces, the smallest charm can feel like armor. They didn't need proof, they needed peace, and sometimes faith alone provided it. Hours would pass like that, the slow rhythm of breathing, the creak of settling wood, the sigh of wind slipping through the thatch. The night was long, but their patience longer. Time moved differently here. A minute could stretch like a lifetime, or an hour could pass in a blink. Sleep came in waves, not one solid block, but in fragments. A peasant might wake in the middle of the night, tend the fire, whisper another prayer, then drift back into slumber. This pattern, called segmented sleep by historians, was natural in a world without clocks. They didn't fight it. The hours between sleeps were a kind of meditation. Some used them to pray, others to think, a few even to sit outside and watch the stars. It was their private time when the rest of the world was silent, and they could finally hear themselves. Imagine that scene for a moment, a man sitting outside his hut at midnight, wrapped in a wool cloak, the world so quiet he can hear his own heartbeat. Above him, stars burn cold and steady. Beside him, his home glows faintly with the warmth of life. He doesn't know the names of constellations or the science of sleep, but he knows something truer, that peace is not the absence of hardship, but the endurance of it. And so, the night passes slowly, beautifully, completely. When morning light finally breaks, the peasants rise, not refreshed, but grateful, because gratitude itself was the only luxury they could afford. You might think of sleep as something natural, something your body just does when it's tired. But for a medieval peasant, sleep wasn't a guarantee. It was a fragile gift, one that could easily be broken by the groan of the wind, the cry of an animal, or the simple ache of hunger. The wooden hut creaked like an old ship at sea, every sound amplified in the quiet hours. The family slept close together, not because of affection alone, but because body heat was the only real insulation against the biting cold. Children curled into their parents, sometimes even the pig joined in, its thick hide radiating a surprising warmth. It was not uncommon for people to wake in the night with frost gathering on the thatch above, and condensation freezing in delicate patterns on the inside of the walls. They would pull their rags tighter, whisper a short prayer, and close their eyes again, hoping to fall back into whatever dream had offered them brief escape. In those hours, time didn't move as we know it. There was no clock ticking, no hum of a heater or buzz of electricity. Only the slow rhythm of breath, the faint crackle of cooling embers, and the occasional drip of melting frost. Sleep came in segments, what historians call the first sleep and the second sleep. The first might last a few hours, deep and heavy, born of exhaustion. Then came a period of wakefulness, often around midnight. People might talk quietly, pray, or even step outside to relieve themselves beneath the cold stars. This was a time of strange calm, a space between worlds, half dream and half reality. Some believed it was the best time to speak to God, when the veil between heaven and earth was thinnest. Others simply used it to think, to sit near the fire, and to listen. You can imagine that small moment, a man waking in the dark, rubbing his eyes, stirring the ashes back to life with an iron poker. Sparks leap, painting the hut's beams with momentary light. He sits there, staring into the glow, his face a mix of fatigue and quiet acceptance. His wife turns in her straw bed, murmuring something in her sleep. Outside, the wind has softened. He feels the weight of the day just past and the uncertainty of the next. This middle-of-the-night pause isn't lonely. It's human. A rare moment to simply exist, between the endless demands of daylight and the deep pull of sleep. After this interval, they would drift again into their second sleep, which carried them toward dawn. Dreams in this half of the night were said to be clearer, more truthful, the kind that lingered after waking. In the morning, when the first grey light seeped through the thatch, people sometimes shared what they had seen. A woman might speak of a dream where she walked through a field of ice, and someone would nod solemnly, saying it meant hardship was near. A man might dream of fire and take it as a sign of passion or warning. For them, the boundaries between the physical and the mystical were soft. Sleep was not just rest. It was a space where meaning was found, where the unseen world spoke in symbols only the humble seemed to understand. And yet, survival often depended on practical things too, the kind of wisdom passed from one generation to the next, not written in books but remembered in hands and habits. Before sleeping, they would bank the fire carefully, pushing ash over the coals to keep them alive till morning. They'd hang herbs or garlic near the door, believing they kept illness or evil at bay. Mothers made sure the children's feet were dry, for they knew dampness bred sickness faster than cold. Some families even slept with their few coins or tools beside them, afraid a thief might sneak in while they dreamed. It was a kind of nightly ritual, not of comfort, but of control, however small, but even the best preparations couldn't silence the winter. On certain nights, frost crept so thick across the ground that it cracked the soil. The wooden walls groaned under the weight of ice. If the fire went out, the cold became a living force, a thief that stole heat from the breath itself. People spoke of it as if it had a will of its own, a ghost pressing against the door. There were stories of families found in the morning, their hut quiet, their bodies huddled, together, but still, as if simply frozen mid-dream. The line between sleeping and dying could be as thin as a single ember. Still, life went on. Every dawn that followed such a night felt like proof of strength. They rose stiff and coughing, their joints aching from the damp, but their eyes clear with purpose. Water would have frozen solid in the bucket, so someone broke it with a stick. Smoke curled again from the hearth, and the sound of chores returned, scraping bowls, feeding the animals, sweeping the straw floor. The hardships of the night faded quickly, because survival allowed no time for reflection. To live another day was enough. And yet, somewhere in all that struggle, there was beauty. Maybe it was in the way sunlight struck the frost, turning every blade of grass into glass, or in the quiet kindness shared between neighbors who traded a handful of wood or a loaf of bread. The nights were brutal, yes, but they forged a closeness, a kind of community we barely understand today. In those small huts, where privacy didn't exist and comfort was rare, humanity itself was the warmth that kept them alive. To sleep in a medieval hut during winter was not a simple act of rest. It was a form of courage repeated every night. Every creak of timber, every sigh in the dark was a reminder that they were alive in a world that wanted them gone. Their dreams, however humble, were the only places untouched by frost and hunger. They carried their hopes there for spring, for a good harvest, for their children to see another year. And when they awoke, coughing in the smoke, shaking straw from their hair, they didn't complain. They simply began again, because in their world, to endure was to live. And to live, no matter how small the fire, was victory enough. When dawn finally came to a medieval village, it didn't arrive gently. There were no alarm clocks, no chirping phones, no soft electric hum to ease people awake. The morning light crept in like a pale ghost, sliding between the cracks of the hut's thatch and falling across faces roughened by smoke and sleep. For a few seconds, no one moved, as if testing the air, making sure the world was still there. Then the sounds began. The stretch of limbs under worn wool, the cough of an old man, the squeal of a pig shaking off straw, the faint rattle of a wooden ladle against a pot. The cold was still there, sharp and insistent. The fire, reduced to a few sullen embers, waited to be coaxed back to life. The first task of the morning wasn't to eat or pray, it was to survive the next few minutes without freezing. A mother might rise first, wrapping her shawl tight, crouching by the hearth with fingers so stiff they could barely bend. She blew gently, then harder, until a thin ribbon of smoke curled upward. When the flame caught, its tiny orange light spread across the room like a promise. That first fire of the day wasn't just warmth, it was renewal. Proof that they'd endured another night. The children would stir next, blinking through the haze of smoke. Their cheeks were chapped, noses running, hands red from the cold. They reached for whatever warmth they could find, a corner near the fire, their mother's lap, the coarse fur of the family dog. Outside, the frost still clung to the earth like glass. The fields were white and silent, the trees frozen in place. You could almost hear the world holding its breath. Breakfast, if you could call it that, was simple. Maybe a bowl of pottage left over from the night before, thin and lukewarm. Maybe a crust of bread, hardened by the air. Sometimes a bit of ale, weaker than what you'd imagine, but safer than the water from the well. The taste didn't matter. Food was fuel, nothing more. The real feast was in the firelight, and in the company being alive together was its own kind of blessing. Once everyone had eaten, the day began in earnest. The men pulled on rough cloaks and stepped outside, where their breath turned instantly to mist. They'd head to the fields, the forest, or the Lord's manor, depending on what the day demanded. The women stayed behind, tending to the hut, cleaning the floor of straw, mending clothes, stirring whatever was left in the pot. Children helped as best they could, feeding animals, gathering twigs for fuel. The day's rhythm wasn't fast or loud. It was steady, ancient, and deeply human. In those first few minutes after waking, peasants carried the weight of everything, their hunger, their duties, their fatigue. But they also carried something more subtle, gratitude. You might not see it in their faces, but it lived in small gestures, the way they crossed themselves before stepping out into the frost, the way they looked toward the rising sun and murmured a soft "thank you" to a God who never answered in words. In a world where death came often and easily, waking up was an event worth honoring. The light of morning revealed everything the night had hidden. the mud walls, cracked but still standing, the soot on the beams, the pile of straw that served as a bed, the simple tools leaning near the door. There was no illusion here, no comfort, no luxury, but there was an unmistakable sense of endurance. Each object, each scar on the wood, told a story of persistence. If you could stand there with them, breathe that sharp, smoky air, feel the sting of cold on your skin, you'd understand something we've forgotten. Comfort was never a right. It was a reward, earned every single day. For peasants, to wake was to begin again, knowing the world outside didn't care whether they lived or died. And yet, they still lit the fire, still shared their meagre bread, still laughed when the youngest spilled water or the dog snatched a crust. Survival alone wasn't enough. They found meaning in the small defiance of hope. There was something holy about that first hour of daylight, not in the grand cathedral sense, but in the quiet humility of ordinary life. The light filtering through smoke, turning the air golden, the sound of footsteps crunching on frost, the faint ringing of a distant church bell not calling nobles or scholars, but peasants, the heartbeat of the world. They'd pause, bow their heads for a moment, and then return to their work. Prayer wasn't a ritual performed for approval. It was a habit woven into the fabric of survival, like breathing. As the sun climbed higher, its weak warmth began to soften the frost. The village slowly came alive, doors opened, voices rose, the smell of baking or brewing drifted through the air. For a brief while, winter didn't seem so cruel. There was work to do, mouths to feed, things to fix. And in that movement, that daily repetition, there was a strange kind of peace. Life didn't have to be beautiful to be meaningful. It just had to continue. The morning stretched slowly, like an old limb waking from sleep. The first rays of light fell across the frozen ground, and the mist began to lift, revealing the scars of the land, the ruts carved by wooden carts, the deep footprints from yesterday's toil, the blackened patches where fires had burned low in the night. The huts stood close together, their roofs glistening under a layer of frost. From every chimney, thin trails of smoke spiraled into the air, merging into one faint grey ribbon that drifted above the village like a sign of life. Inside one hut, the sound of chopping echoed faintly. Firewood. Always firewood. In winter, it was more precious than gold. Each log represented warmth, food, light, and the thin barrier between life and death. Peasants spent hours gathering sticks from hedges and fallen branches from the Lord's forest, careful not to be seen by the watchman who could punish them for trespassing. Even a child, barely strong enough to lift a bundle, would join in the work. There was no leisure here, only necessity. By the time the sun cleared the trees, the air had begun to stir, not warmer, but alive. The men moved toward the fields, wrapped in coarse wool cloaks stiff with frost. Their boots sank into the frozen mud with every step. Tools were carried like extensions of the body, the hoe, the mattock, the wooden rake. The women remained behind, their hands red and cracked, busy with endless tasks, mending, washing, scraping, feeding. Nothing in a peasant's life was ever truly finished. There was always something to patch, to stir, to clean, to fix. The hut smelled of smoke and damp straw. If you looked closely, you'd see the little things that made life bearable. A wooden spoon smoothed by years of use, a sprig of herbs hanging from a beam, a clay jug patched with wax, a child's carving made from scrap wood. These weren't luxuries, they were reminders that even in poverty, people made space for beauty. Every scratch, every stain, every mark inside those walls told a story of care and survival. Outside, the village came alive in slow motion. A blacksmith's hammer began to ring faintly from across the lane, a rhythmic heartbeat of metal on metal. Chickens scratched at the frozen ground. The smell of baking bread drifted from the communal oven, mixing with wood smoke and the scent of damp earth. It was a small world, but to those who lived in it, it was everything. Sleep still lingered in their bones, the heaviness of a night spent on straw, the ache in the shoulders, the stiffness in the knees. But peasants didn't speak of tiredness. It wasn't a condition to be cured. It was life itself. The idea of rest as we know it didn't exist. Even on holy days, when work was forbidden, they were still busy mending fences, tending to animals, preparing food. The only true rest came in brief moments. A pause to sip ale, a shared laugh, a moment of stillness by the hearth. As the hours passed, sunlight began to strike the fields, glinting off the frost. You could almost see the air shimmer as the ground thawed slightly. It was back-breaking work, but it gave meaning to the endless cycle of survival. They tilled soil that would not feed them, built roads they'd never travel, and worked for lords whose names they might never speak aloud. Yet, they did it all without bitterness, because to complain was pointless. The world did not bend for their comfort. Still, hope found its way in strange places, in the hush of morning prayer, in the laughter of children chasing each other across the yard, in the simple rhythm of a woman humming while she kneaded dough. These small things, invisible to history, were the real heartbeats of the medieval world. They didn't write books or paint frescoes, but they built the foundation of every castle, every city, every story. If you could walk among them, you'd feel something remarkable, not despair, but acceptance. Their lives were difficult, but not meaningless. They didn't dream of wealth or comfort the way we do. They dreamed of continuity, of making it through another winter, another harvest, another year. Their sleep at night wasn't an escape, it was a rehearsal for endurance, and their mornings were the proof that endurance worked. By midday, the sky would turn pale blue, the kind of light that never quite feels warm. You could see the steam rise from their breath as they worked. Somewhere, a church bell tolled again, marking the hour for prayer. The sound carried across the frost and into every hut, every heart. No one stopped working entirely, they just bowed their heads for a brief moment, whispered their thanks, and kept moving. Faith wasn't a thing to display. It was something carried quietly, like an ember under the ash. The night in those wooden huts was not silent. Even when the world outside lay buried under snow, the inside carried its own living orchestra. You could hear the slow sighs of timber swelling with moisture, the rustle of straw as someone shifted in their sleep, the faint crackle of a dying ember trying to stay alive. In that quiet music, life persisted. People didn't just endure the cold, they adapted to it in small, ingenious ways. They would place heated stones, wrapped in cloth, beneath their feet before lying down. Children were tucked together like kittens beneath the same blanket, their breath clouding in the dim light. The parents always took the edges, their bodies forming a barrier between the biting air and their sleeping children. Outside, the wind scraped across the hut's roof like a restless hand. Every sound was amplified, the groan of branches, the faraway howl of wolves, even the soft flutter of snow falling from the eaves. And yet, for those inside, that noise became familiar, comforting even. It was the sound of survival, the nightly reminder that the walls still held, that the fire hadn't gone out, that they were still safe within the fragile womb of wood and earth they called home. They learned to live with that darkness, to breathe in rhythm with it. Each night was a small ritual of trust that the fire would last, that the roof would hold, that dawn would return. Sleep came not as a luxury, but as a kind of surrender. To sleep in a medieval hut during winter was to hand yourself over to the mercy of nature, to say, "I have done all I can. The rest belongs to the night." Morning in a medieval hut was never gentle. There was no soft light spilling through curtains, no hum of radiators or birdsong neatly timed with sunrise. Instead, dawn crept in slowly, grey and reluctant, seeping through cracks in the timber like a ghost testing the edges of the room. The first thing you noticed wasn't light at all, it was cold, a kind of deep, bone-biting chill that made your skin tighten and your breath turn solid in the air. The fire had long burned down to ash, and the faint glow from the embers was buried under last night's soot. Someone always had to rise first, usually the oldest or the toughest, to coax life back into that sleeping hearth. Imagine the sound, the gentle rattle of kindling, the soft curse under one's breath as numb fingers fumbled with flint. Sparks flared, tiny stars for a moment, before smoke began to curl upward, filling the low roof with its earthy smell. Children stirred beneath their straw bedding, their hair matted with frost from their own breath. The pig in the corner gave a complaining grunt, half buried in hay, while the family dog shook itself awake, scattering bits of straw like snowflakes. The hut was coming alive again, one small noise at a time. As the fire caught, light began to spill across the room, orange, uneven, but warm. Faces emerged from shadow. The lines of exhaustion, the pale skin from lack of sunlight, the raw red hands cracked from work. And yet there was something beautiful in that routine. These people, who had so little, began each day with a quiet determination that felt almost sacred. The first task was always the same: protect the fire, feed it, nurture it, because that fire was everything. It cooked their food, dried their clothes, kept sickness at bay. It was their clock, their heart, their proof of life. Breakfast, if you could call it that, was humble. A crust of bread soaked in warm broth, maybe a sliver of cheese if fortune smiled, or leftover pottage from the night before. There was no concept of luxury, only necessity. Each bite was measured, every scrap accounted for. Food wasn't just nourishment, it was survival, quantified, rationed by season and harvest. And yet, even in such scarcity, there was gratitude. They would murmur brief prayers before eating, not long or loud, but soft, personal acknowledgments to forces greater than themselves. Once the stomachs were settled, the day's labor began, even before the sun had fully risen. Men and older boys trudged outside, their boots crunching through snow-crusted ground, carrying tools dulled by years of use. They would mend fences, check traps, fetch water from a stream often half frozen over. Women swept the floor, tended the animals, patched clothing by the dim light of the hearth. Every action was practical, deliberate. Time was not a thing to waste. It was a resource as precious as wood or grain. And then there was the ever-present smoke. It clung to everything, to skin, to hair, to breath. It was both a shield and a burden. On days when the wind turned wrong, the hut would fill with it, eyes watering, lungs burning. But they endured it, because it was safer than the alternative. To open the door too wide was to invite the cold inside, to let winter win another inch. Even the air was rationed in a way. People learned to live in half light, half breath, half comfort, yet somehow full of life. Outside, the world looked endless and white. Fields stretched out under blankets of frost, dotted with bare trees that looked like skeletons of summer. Crows called from the distance, their black shapes cutting through the grey sky like ink on parchment. The horizon was both beautiful and bleak. For the medieval peasant, beauty was never separate from struggle. It lived inside it. The same snow that made the world shimmer with purity also buried their crops and froze their wells. The same quiet that seemed peaceful could easily become loneliness if the fire failed and the nights grew too long. Back inside, the rhythm continued. The mother hummed softly while stirring the pot, her tune lost somewhere between lullaby and prayer. The children fought sleep again near the hearth, rubbing their eyes as they clutched wooden toys carved by their father in quieter hours. Those toys, simple animals, little horses, crude dolls, were proof that even in hardship, people found ways to create, to dream, to remember tenderness. There was no separation between life and survival. They existed as one. To live was to endure, but also to cherish. If you closed your eyes, you could almost feel that life-rough hands brushing against coarse wool, the steady rhythm of a broom across the earthen floor, the warmth of the fire licking your face while the cold gnawed at your back. You could taste the wood smoke, hear the drip of melting frost from the roof, smell the mixture of peat, stew, and life itself. It was a symphony of the ordinary, and yet it carried the weight of history in every note. Because here's the thing most people forget. The medieval world wasn't made of kings and knights and castles. It was made of huts. Millions of them, huddled together in fields and forests, each one a heartbeat in the vast body of a forgotten world. Inside those huts, people dreamed, argued, laughed, and loved. They lived entire lives that history rarely bothered to record. But if you listen closely enough, you can still hear them in the creak of old wood, in the whisper of the wind through the thatch, in the quiet hum of a story that refuses to die. As the morning grew older, the frost outside began to melt just enough to turn the ground into a slick, muddy mess. Each step squelched underfoot, the air still thick with the bite of winter. From afar, smoke rose in thin spirals from the neighbouring huts, merging into a pale sky the colour of tin. Life in the village moved slowly, like sap in a frozen tree. Every household was its own small universe, governed by the same simple laws: keep the fire alive, keep the bellies full, and keep the cold out. For the medieval peasant, the day was not something to be conquered. It was something to survive. They had no clocks, no schedules carved in stone, only instinct and habit. The sun's position told them when to work, when to eat, when to rest. When the light faded, so did their strength. And yet, there was an unspoken dignity in that rhythm. These were people who did not chase the future, they endured the present. Their world was not one of ambition or luxury, but of quiet endurance and fleeting warmth. Sometimes, during the harshest winters, families would move closer together, visiting each other's huts when the snow wasn't too deep. They'd share stories, bits of gossip, maybe trade a loaf of bread for a pinch of salt or a handful of dried herbs. These small exchanges weren't just about survival, they were about connection. In a world ruled by frost, companionship was its own form of heat. They would sit in a circle near the hearth, faces glowing from firelight, shadows dancing across the walls. One would speak, the others would listen. The stories were often about saints or spirits, lost travelers, or miracles that once happened in a neighboring village. Sometimes they told darker tales too, of ghosts wandering the frozen woods, of cries carried on the wind that weren't made by any living thing. For the children, these nights were unforgettable. Their eyes would widen as they huddled closer to their mothers, half terrified, half thrilled. But for the elders, such tales were warnings dressed as entertainment, reminders that life in the medieval world always hovered between safety and danger, warmth and death. Outside, the cold could kill. Inside, the smoke could choke. There was no middle ground. To live was to walk a narrow bridge between both. As the day wore on, the hut filled with movement again. Someone chopped wood outside, each strike echoing through the village like a heartbeat. The sound carried far, through fog and frost, blending with the occasional bleat of a goat or the caw of a crow. A woman drew water from the well, her hands raw and red. Another spread straw near the doorway to soak up the damp. The smell of stew returned, simple, earthy, made from whatever could be spared. Barley, onions, cabbage, maybe a sliver of pork if the family was lucky. The aroma filled the hut, masking for a moment the musk of smoke and mud. The evening came faster than expected. In winter, the sun seemed to give up early, surrendering to the darkness long before anyone was ready. Shadows thickened, stretching like fingers across the walls. The fire became the only source of light once again, a small defiance against the coming night. The family gathered closer, bodies pressed together for warmth. There was no concept of privacy, only togetherness. Children leaned against their parents. Old grandparents wrapped themselves in whatever cloth they could find. And the animals, yes, even the animals remained inside, sharing their body heat with the humans who fed them. It was a strange sort of harmony, born not from choice but from necessity. In that dim glow, time seemed to lose meaning. The outside world, lords, wars, kings, might as well have been another planet. Inside the hut, life was small but complete. The hiss of the fire, the murmur of a lullaby, the creak of timber, it was all the music they needed. And as night deepened once more, the family prepared for sleep in the only way they knew how. Together, wrapped in straw, warmed by breath and faith. There's something almost poetic in that image, a family of 6 or 7, lying side by side under the smoky rafters, a single ember glowing at the center of their world. The cold still pressed at the walls, but for now, they were safe. They had survived another day, and tomorrow, they would do it all again. As the night settled again, the line between waking and sleeping blurred. In the half-dark of those wooden huts, dreams and reality mingled like smoke. The fire crackled faintly, and its shadows moved across the walls like wandering spirits. For the medieval peasant, sleep wasn't something that arrived all at once. It came in phases, interrupted and fragile. Historians now call it segmented sleep. People would drift into slumber for a few hours, then wake in the middle of the night, their minds still caught between the world of dreams and the dim glow of the hearth. During those waking hours, they might whisper prayers, stoke the fire, or simply sit in silence, listening to the world breathe outside. There was no clock to mark those hours, no sense of time except for the fading of the embers. It was in that strange quiet that thoughts grew heavy. A mother might check on her sleeping child, brushing the straw from their hair. A man might mend a tool by the firelight, his hands working from memory. Some prayed for the sick, some thought about the harvest yet to come, and some simply listened to the wind, to the sigh of the rafters, to their own heartbeat echoing in the silence. It was a kind of peace born from exhaustion, a meditation that required no words. And then, slowly, sleep would return for its second visit. They called it the morning sleep, softer and deeper than the first. In that phase, dreams came easily. Sometimes they were simple of warmth, of sunlight, of bread baking in summer kitchens. But sometimes they were strange, filled with half-remembered stories told by candlelight. The villagers believed that dreams carried messages, that in the coldest hours, when the world was silent and still, the spirit world drew closest. It wasn't superstition, it was a way to make sense of loneliness. In a world without clocks, without light, without noise, the imagination became the only bridge between night and dawn. Outside, the land lay motionless under its frozen blanket. You could walk for miles and hear nothing but your own breath. Even the rivers had stopped moving, trapped beneath sheets of ice. Yet, in that stillness, the smallest things became sacred. A bird's call at dawn, the sound of dripping ice, the first sliver of sunlight piercing the horizon, all of it felt like miracles. The people who lived in those huts may not have had wealth, but they had something rarer, an intimacy with the world's smallest wonders. To sleep in such conditions was not just rest, it was defiance. Every night they lay down was an act of trust that the fire would hold, that the roof would not collapse, that the cold would not find its way in. They slept, knowing the fragility of everything, their huts, their health, their lives. And yet, somehow, they always found warmth enough to dream. There's a strange kind of beauty in that, isn't there? Today, we turn on heaters, close windows, and chase comfort as though it's a birthright. But for them, comfort was a reward earned only after a day of battle with the elements. Their sleep wasn't peaceful because the world was kind, it was peaceful because they had survived it. When they finally drifted into rest, it was with the deep satisfaction of endurance, the same way a sailor sleeps after surviving a storm. And in that sleep, they became something more than just peasants. They became part of the rhythm of the earth, the cold, the dark, the dawn. Their breath mingled with the smoke, their dreams folded into the wood and straw that surrounded them. Even centuries later, if you stand in an old field on a winter night and listen closely, you can almost hear it, the faint hum of life that once filled those huts. The heartbeat of survival itself. By the time the faint light of dawn began to seep through the cracks in the thatch, the air inside the hut had turned thick with breath and smoke. The embers glowed faintly, their colour fading from orange to dull grey. Someone stirred the oldest son, maybe, or the mother who never truly slept. With aching joints and heavy limbs, they reached out to the hearth, pushing aside the ash to uncover a flicker of heat. A few twigs, a slow breath, and that small spark caught again, trembling but alive. In that moment, before the day truly began, there was a hush, a sacred quiet that belonged only to those who had outlasted another night. That first rekindling of the fire was more than habit. It was renewal. It meant that the world hadn't won, that frost hadn't taken their home, that life continued to hum beneath layers of cold and silence. And as the smoke rose, curling between the rafters, the hut began to breathe again. Children shifted under blankets, murmuring in half-sleep. The father sat up, his breath clouding before his face. The pig snorted, the rooster crowed somewhere in the dark. It was a symphony of survival, unpolished, imperfect, but achingly real. If you stepped outside then, you would see a world caught between night and morning. The sky was still bruised with the colour of shadow, and the ground shimmered with frost that looked like powdered glass. In the distance, other huts began to stir, their chimneys coughing out ribbons of smoke into the pale air. Each plume meant a family still alive, another day earned. The sound of an axe splitting wood echoed faintly, steady and rhythmic, like a drumbeat calling the village back to life. The medieval peasant's world was small, but it was not empty. Every task carried weight. Fetching water, feeding animals, mending tools, these were acts of devotion, not to a god of grandeur, but to life itself. They believed that to work was to pray, and that the simplest labour, done faithfully, could hold as much grace as a hymn sung in a cathedral. Their huts were chapels without crosses, sanctuaries of smoke and straw, where faith wasn't declared, it was lived. And maybe that's what we've lost in our own comfortable nights. The awareness that warmth is a gift, that sleep is a privilege, that survival itself can be sacred. For the people in those wooden huts, Every dawn was proof of endurance, a silent triumph whispered into the cold. When they slept, they didn't dream of riches or thrones, they dreamed of spring, of soil that would thaw, of rivers that would move again, of fields reborn under the sun. Their hope was humble but fierce. It lived not in words, but in the simple act of rising each morning and beginning again. Inside the hut, the family gathered near the fire once more. The mother's voice broke the quiet, soft and steady, as she hummed an old song her grandmother once sang in winters long gone. The children listened, eyes half closed, their small faces illuminated by the firelight. Outside, the world might have been frozen solid, but in that moment, warmth bloomed like a secret flower, fragile, fleeting, but real. The wind howled again at the walls, but it no longer frightened them. They knew the rhythm now, the push and pull between comfort and cold. They knew that each night would test them, and each morning would demand their will. And still they stayed. Still they slept. Still they dreamed beneath the low rafters and smoky air. Because even when the world turned against them, they had something no frost could steal, the stubborn, quiet heartbeat of human endurance. So when you imagine them tonight, those nameless men and women curled together under straw and ash, don't see misery. See the miracle of ordinary survival. See a world where sleep wasn't just rest, but rebellion, where every ember glowing in the dark meant another chance, another breath, another story carried into the morning. As centuries passed, whispers of these strange happenings grew fainter, buried beneath the dust of progress and the hum of modern life. The city transformed brick by brick, light by light, until the echoes of its darker days seemed nothing more than superstition. But beneath the glow of neon, beneath the music and laughter that filled its streets, something ancient still lingered. In the cellars of forgotten buildings, in sealed basements never reopened after the wars, the air still carried that same damp, metallic taste, the scent of something that refused to die. Some historians claimed that the haunted places of Shanghai weren't haunted at all, merely memories burned into the walls, the emotional residue of generations that lived and suffered within them. Yet those who had stood in those ruins after dark told a different story. They spoke of cold drafts moving against the wind, of lights flickering where no power ran, and of faces, pale, silent faces glimpsed through shattered windows. There were even reports, decades later, of construction workers digging through old opium dens and uncovering strange sealed rooms filled with symbols written in old ink, preserved like a ritual. The workers said the air that escaped was not just musty, it was suffocating, as if the room itself had been holding its breath for 100 years. One man claimed that after opening one of those chambers, he began seeing the same man in his dreams every night, an old trader with cloudy eyes, whispering in a language he didn't understand. By the time he left the city, he said he could no longer tell if he was dreaming or awake. The sound of that whisper, a dry, rasping murmur, followed him everywhere. And so, even as the modern skyline of Shanghai reached toward the clouds, the shadows beneath it stretched just as far downward. Beneath every city built on sin, there lies a ledger of debt, and Shanghai, with its glittering past of greed and gold, of smoke and sorrow, still pays its interest in whispers, in sleepless nights, and in stories told only when the lights go out. There's a certain kind of beauty in ruins, the way time wraps its fingers around stone, the way silence becomes thicker where voices once lived. In the hidden corners of old Shanghai, this beauty feels almost deliberate, as though the city itself remembers every sin, every deal, every night when smoke curled through the streets like a ghost searching for its grave. When travelers from faraway lands came to Shanghai in the early 1900s, they found a city that shimmered with contradiction. By day, it was alive with commerce and ambition. Trams rattled past, grand hotels, and the scent of freshly brewed tea drifted from small shops. But when the sun sank behind the Huangpu River, a different Shanghai emerged. The air grew heavy with perfume and opium smoke, and the soft notes of a shamisen or piano floated from behind red curtained doors. It was a world both intoxicating and poisonous. A theatre of pleasure built on quiet suffering. Foreign merchants filled the Bund with wealth and influence, while Chinese workers laboured unseen in narrow alleyways, their sweat and silence the true foundation of the city's glittering facade. Yet it wasn't just men and money that flowed through Shanghai's veins, it was secrets. Secrets traded more fiercely than silver, whispered more carefully than prayers, a misplaced letter, a photograph, a name overheard in the wrong place. These were worth more than gold in a city balanced so delicately between worlds. And in this twilight world, opium became the great equalizer. From the grand parlors of colonial mansions to the damp dens of the underclass, it erased the boundaries between power and despair. The same sweet smoke drifted through every window, carrying dreams, hallucinations, and sometimes madness. Many believed that Shanghai was cursed not by war or corruption, but by the spirits of those who had died in the haze of addiction, trapped forever between sleep and death. Some sailors spoke of wandering the riverbanks at night and seeing figures standing just beyond the mist, men in fine coats or women in silk dresses, their faces blank, their eyes fixed on the city lights, as if trying to remember something they had lost. The sailors said these weren't ghosts, but echoes, the afterimage of souls burned too bright, too fast. But the real Shanghai, the one that existed beneath the smoke and the shimmer, was far more fragile than it appeared. Beneath the grand architecture and the flicker of electric lamps lay a network of wooden beams, paper walls, and whispered debts. Life here could collapse with the weight of a single night's misfortune. A lost job, a stolen coin, a fever that came with the rain. It was all it took for comfort to dissolve into survival. Those who lived in the wooden huts by Suzhou Creek knew this better than anyone. The cold from the river seeped into everything, into the walls, into the bones, even into the dreams. Families slept close together, not only for warmth, but for safety. The faint glow of an oil lamp might flicker beside them, painting their faces gold and shadow. Outside, the wind moaned through the cracks like a living thing, reminding them how thin the line was between home and hunger. In these tight quarters, people learned to live with every sound, the whisper of a neighbor, the shuffle of feet on wooden planks, the distant wail of a siren in the foreign districts. And sometimes, in the silence before dawn, they could hear the city breathing, the slow pulse of humanity moving through the fog, carrying both hope and despair in equal measure. The nights were long in those huts. Some found solace in the smallest rituals, boiling tea with the last of their coal, patching clothes by the dim light, or telling stories to children about a time when life had been gentler. Others simply sat awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint creak of the world around them. For many, sleep itself became a kind of luxury, a fragile truce between exhaustion and fear. Some believed that if they let their minds drift too far, they might never return from whatever dream the opium smoke carried with it. And so they stayed half awake, half dreaming, somewhere between the real and the unreal, just like Shanghai itself. As the first light of morning touched the rooftops of old Shanghai, the city seemed to sigh, as though it was finally exhaling the ghosts of another sleepless night. The smoke faded, the streets began to stir, and life once again slipped back into its endless rhythm. But beneath it all, something lingered. A quiet memory of those who had lived and dreamed inside the wooden huts, who had fought to survive the cold, and who had traded their peace for a few moments of warmth or escape. History doesn't always live in grand monuments or palaces. Sometimes it hides in the cracks of forgotten walls, in the whispers carried by the wind, in the stories of people whose names time chose to forget. And maybe, if you listen closely enough, in the hush of night, or the soft hum of a city half asleep, you can still hear them. The sound of life, fragile, yet enduring. The sound of survival. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, remember this. Those wooden huts were more than shelters. They were small fortresses of human spirit, built against the cold, against despair, against time itself. And though their walls are long gone, their warmth still glows faintly in history's memory, a gentle light that refuses to fade. Soft outro music tone. If you enjoyed this calm journey into the past, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves quiet stories from forgotten times. Your support helps keep history alive, one soothing story at a time.